rise and welcome our Honorable Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley. And I also welcome Honorable Vice President of Côte d'Ivoire, Mr. Daniel Kablan Duncan. Thank you. You may please be seated now. Thank you. May I request Mr. Charles Boma, Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank, to also join the panelists on stage, please. Thank you, sir. We welcome the Honorable Vice President of Côte d'Ivoire, Mr. Daniel Duncan, to India. Thank you. Now I'll request Mrs. Chandrajit Banerjee, Director General of Confederation of Indian Industry, to kindly start off with the lamp lighting ceremony. Thank you.
Honorable Shri Arun Jaitley, the Minister of Finance, Corporate Affairs and Defense of the Government of India, Mr. Daniel Kablan Duncan, the Honorable Vice President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, Mr. Charles Bouama, the Vice President of the African Development Bank, Shri Shaktikanta Das, the Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Finance of the Government of India, Mr. David Ruskina, the Managing Director of Exim Bank, Mr. Rakesh Bharti Mittal, President-Designate of CII, Excellencies, senior officials of the AFDB and African governments, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Let me accord a very warm welcome to this inaugural session of this very important session that we are having on Africa-India Cooperation 2017. It's partnership to industrialize and move Africa up the value chains. That's the topic that we have given to this session over the next couple of days. It's an honor for the industry from CII to be partnering with the Ministry of Finance, the African Development Bank and Exim Bank on the sessions on Africa-India cooperation in conjunction with this 52nd annual meeting of the African Development Bank. I'd wish to welcome all of you, dear participants, to this a very important function. I'd especially like to welcome the participants from overseas, from Africa, to this to our country and to this state of Gujarat. And in that, I would like to really accord our thanks to the government of Gujarat for hosting such a wonderful event in such an immaculate way, the way it's been done since yesterday. It is, today, India is privileged to host the first annual meeting, or rather the fourth annual meeting outside of the African continent over here in India. Your decision to hold the meeting in India is indeed an abiding testament to the age-old friendship that one has between India and Africa, as well as the strength of our economic engagement and its potential. We have with us today one of our most proactive proponents of India-Africa relationships, our Honorable Mr. Arun Jaitley, the Finance Minister, Corporate Affairs and Defense Minister of the country. India is the fastest growing large economy, and strong fundamentals which have really enabled it to do so over the last couple of years, when global cues are indeed very weak, and that is in large measure owing to the astute handling of the economy by our Honorable Finance Minister. Only 2 days back, he announced the rates of the transformational tax, the goods and services tax, GST, which would change India and Indian markets as we know it. India would now be a single market in its true sense. Under the tremendous pulls and pressures, he has done it in a manner that it benefits all stakeholders, industry, consumers, and of course, the revenue departments of the center and the states. It's a great move and a great achievement. That's what we all have felt across the industry. We'd want to once again very, very warmly welcome our Honorable Finance Minister to this very important function. We're also honored to welcome Mr. Daniel Kablan-Duncan, Honorable Vice President of Cote d'Ivoire, who is no stranger for such meets between Africa and India. A very warm and special welcome also to Mr. Charles Boomer, the Vice President of the AFDB. AFDB's focus on electricity, food, integration, industrialization, and quality of life matches well with India's developmental priorities. Also, a very, very special welcome to the chief architect, if I can say so, of the event, Mr. Shaktikanta Das, the Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs of the Government of India. The sessions on India-Africa cooperation build on the India-Africa Forum meetings will continue to drive economic cooperation with the active participation of industry sectors of both sides. The Confederation of Indian Industry is deeply privileged to participate in this landmark event. We know for the last 3 decades as an institution, we have been very strongly involved with the African continent, and with our partners Exim Bank, over the last many years, we have been able to institutionalize this mechanism of the industry summit between Africa and India. And in that, if I can say so, which got a strong fillip a couple of years back when India hosted the India-Africa Forum Summit. And since then, we have had the participation of AFDB very strongly in the industrial meets. And in this, we have identified several areas during our industry summits that I'd like to once again mention before we start the program. Focuses on agriculture, low-cost technology, infrastructure, healthcare, and AFDB-funded projects in the African countries. I believe we are uniquely placed to promote the AAA, the appropriate, adaptable, and affordable technology of Indian companies in Africa. Through our efforts, through our offices in Africa, and through your participation in India, we do believe that we will be able to achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves. And today's function and today's conference will go a long way towards doing that. The potential is huge, and we have to ensure that we all do our bit to realize that. We have a session spread during the annual meeting, would look back at the various areas of opportunities that we've spoke about, and we shall take it upon ourselves to make this the priority of the industry in India. With that, I would like to once again welcome each one of you to this inaugural session of the Africa-India Collaboration Summit for the Industry. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you once again. Thank you. May I now invite Mr. Rakesh Bharti Mittal to give his remarks.
Honorable Mr. Arun Jaitley, Minister of Finance, Corporate Affairs and Defense, Government of India. Honorable Mr. Daniel Kablan-Duncan, Vice President, Republic of Cote d'Ivoire. Mr. Charles Boma, Mr. Shaktikanta Das, Mr. David Raskina, Excellencies, senior officials of AFDB and African governments, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my personal privilege and honor on behalf of CII to extend a very warm welcome to the distinguished delegates at these sessions on India-Africa cooperation. The city of Ahmedabad has truly made us feel welcome, and I thank the Honorable Chief Minister, Shri Vijay Rupani, and the government of Gujarat for the generous and warm hospitality. It is indeed a very special privilege to have the Honorable Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, grace this session. He is indeed the navigator of the Indian economy and has outlined an intensive reform agenda, which is delivering significant notable results. I also take this occasion to congratulate him on the 3rd anniversary of the government and compliment the minister for his astute management of the Indian economy, which has emerged as the fastest growing large economy during the last 3 years globally. In your address, sir, at the India-Africa Forum Summit in 2015, you rightly stated that India and Africa together can become the engines of growth for the entire world. The Indian industry is fully in agreement with these perspectives. In fact, as active participant in the African continent for the last many decades, we remain strongly committed to our joint emergence as vibrant and thriving global economies. The India-Africa trade has seen a steady rise from just $1 billion in 2000 to a peak of $71 billion in 2014-15. Given the fall in global commodity prices, the trade has come down to around $52 billion in 2016-17. But I must admit that with the rapid growth of both economies, large middle class and consuming societies, our shared developmental aspirations, Indian industry is confident that our economic engagement will continue to be dynamic in the years to come. Some of the world's fastest growing economies are present in Africa, and as I mentioned earlier, the expanding middle class consumers currently are the engines of growth, young workforce and interactive global businesses. It is estimated that Africa's rising demand could add over $1 trillion to its GDP by 2019. And I think that's where the huge opportunities are. We all know Africa is resource rich, leveraged the commodity boom in the past few years. And as a result, the investments from India in Africa have surged to an estimated of $56 billion between 2003 to 2016, the 5th largest in Africa. Indian companies have also participated in advanced sectors such as telecommunications, IT, automotive, and also represented the sectors in infrastructure construction, connectivity, and technology development in Africa. I must also add, Indian industry has proactively enhanced the local capacities by creating jobs, imparting skill development, and boosting local entrepreneurship. We believe that such sustainable initiatives are a model for long-term partnerships. With strong institutional measures established by both sides, such as the India-Africa Forum Summit, Pan-African E-Network, and others, we continue to be bullish on the bilateral economic engagement. Given the huge opportunities, especially in the areas of energy, agriculture, and skilling, and synergies between India and the African continent, the partnership between two regions assumes significance. And I can say that a true reflection of South-South cooperation is where we are today at this session. And I'm sure during the next 3 days of active engagement and discussions, there will be an agenda of going forward, of way forward. And we at CII look forward to those outcomes very keenly. We also look forward to the cooperation agenda in the current session and reiterate our deep interest in doing business with Africa. I once again welcome you to the sessions on Africa-India cooperation, and thank you for organizing the African Development Bank annual meeting here in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I now request Mr. David Ruskina, the Managing Director of Exim Bank, to give his remarks.
The Honorable Minister of Finance, Defence and Corporate Affairs, Government of India, Shri Arun Jaitley, the Honorable Daniel Kablan-Duncan, Vice President of the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire, Mr. Shaktikanta Das, Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Mr. Charles Boama, Vice President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Rakesh Bharti Mittal, Mr. Chandrij Banerjee, dignitaries in the dais and on the audience, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Export-Import Bank of India at the annual meeting of the African Development Bank here in India for the first time. Exim Bank of India's links with the African continent go back many years. Our first representative office in Africa was opened as far back as 1985, and since then we have been at the forefront of building up trade between India and Africa. Today, Exim Bank of India is proud to serve as the policy instrument of the Government of India in its economic diplomacy overseas. Through the Lines of Credit program, which has been a signal success, today Exim Bank of India has provided lines of credit numbering 153, covering more than 50 countries in Africa for a sum of over $7.6 billion under the direction and at the behest of the Government of India. We also operate the Buyer's Credit Program through the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, apart from the Ministries of Finance and Economic Affairs, enabling Indian companies with engineering and project export capability to work in Africa, build up their links, and promote the development of infrastructure in Africa itself. Our links are not restricted to the public sector or to the government as well. Apart from trade links between India and Africa, Exim Bank is also looking at fostering investment, which is primarily driven by the corporate sector and the private sector. We look at building up productive capacity in Africa to take care of the African market as well as the export market. An example is in Ethiopia, where we have recently financed an Indian corporate house to set up a denim manufacturing plant in Ethiopia. This plant will use cotton grown in Africa, spun in Africa into yarn, woven in Africa, dyed in Africa, made into denim, and the denim is then exported to Europe. In due course, as the skills are developed, this would be used for garmenting as well. So as Exim Bank, our focus is not merely on the trade linkages, but on the investment linkages, which create the lasting business flows between the two countries. Apart from the finance area, the bank is also focused on building up knowledge links. Our research and analysis group brings out a steady stream of studies and publications which are available on our website, aimed at giving Indian exporters and Indian investors an idea of the potentialities inherent in the African continent, and also making available to our partners in the African continent the similar knowledge about the opportunities awaiting them out of India. Importantly, and part of our main focus, is the building up of capacity within the African continent. When we were set up back in the 1980s by the Government of India, we received the assistance by way of technical support and training from the Exim Banks of Japan and Korea. We have tried in our own small way to carry this forward and have been instrumental in helping in setting up the Exim Bank agencies in countries like Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and we are very pleased to announce that the latest Exim Bank out of the African continent, that is the Exim Bank of Ghana, a senior team was with us for a full week in the last month, examining and understanding our way of functioning and taking ideas which they could use back in implementing these in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the potential is huge. The African manufacturing is expected to reach close to $900 billion within the next 20 years. A thriving middle class will demand goods for a better standard of living in terms of textiles, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, and in terms of durables. And the potential for linking the Indian subcontinent and the African continent is huge. Both of us have a population of about $1 billion. Both of us have a GDP in the region of about $2 trillion, and the linkages in terms of culture and history are tremendous. As Exim Bank and as the agent and instrumentality of the government, we look forward to playing a role in the growing trade links between our two countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ruskina. May I now invite Mr. Shaktikanta Das, Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, to give his remarks.
Honorable Finance Minister, His Excellency, the Vice President of the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire, Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Mittal, Mr. Banerjee, Mr. Ruskina, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, members of media. I'm extremely happy to be here this morning sharing the dais with some eminent speakers and leaders who have made a difference in their area of work in their respective countries. The event, the next 4 days here in Ahmedabad, the next 4 or 5 days, I think, in Gandhinagar, we are going to witness interaction between India and Africa in the platform provided by the African Development Bank. As you are aware, India has been described variously as a bright spot in the global economy, registering a growth of 7% plus over the last 2 to 3 years, about the last 3 years. And the outlook is that the growth will improve further to 7.5% and perhaps touch 8% in about a year's time. Africa, on the other hand, is a continent of immense opportunities, is a continent of immense possibilities. So it's very timely that the African Development Bank has chosen to hold its 52nd annual meetings here in India and provide this opportunity for a greater and deeper interaction between India and the African member countries of AFDB and the other members of AFDB. I think together there is a lot of opportunity for India and Africa to revive global growth. As you are aware, post-2008, global growth has considerably slowed down. And it's only in the last 2 to 3 years that Asia has become a prime driver of global growth. And in that, India is in the forefront, recording the highest growth rate among the major economies. And on the other hand, as I mentioned, there are immense possibilities in Africa. So I think we should look forward to a decade wherein the cooperation between India and the African countries should be able to make a difference for global growth. India and Africa, as all of us know, have many things in common. The African Economic Outlook 2016 estimates real GDP growth in Africa in 2015 at 3.6%, higher than 3.1%, which the global economy recorded during that period. And this is also much higher than 1.5% growth, which was recorded by the Euro area. Africa was world's second fastest growing region after East Asia. In 2015, sub-Saharan Africa grew faster than continental average at 4.2%, with East Africa leading the way at 6.3%. Africa is now, therefore, a continent of immense possibility. India has had a sustained engagement with Africa as reflected in the India-Africa Forum Summit, which was held in 2015 in New Delhi. The political engagement between Africa and India has been also matched by enhanced cooperation on the economic front. The biggest impetus came from the announcement made by the Honorable Prime Minister of India about a 20 billion support to the African countries through concessional lines of credit provided by the Exim Bank of India. The African Economic Outlook 2016 of AFDB also recognizes India as one of the largest investors in greenfield projects. In fact, I think the total operational credit, credit of the Exim Bank today in Africa is roughly in the order of about $7 billion. The Indian private sector also has played its part. Africa-India trade has reached nearly 72 billion in 2014-15. Combined India-Africa commodity trade in 15-16 was higher than our commodity trade with United States of America, estimated at 61 billion. In about 20 years' time, that is from 1996 to 2016, Africa accounted for nearly 1/5 of India's overseas direct investments. India is also the 5th largest country investing in the continent, with investments over the past 20 years amounting to about 54 billion US dollars, which is about 19.2% of Africa's total foreign direct investment. Such investments do help bring in capital, the much required capital into Africa. They bring in technology and also assist in diversification of economic activity, and most importantly, generate economic activity and employment. As we are aware, I must compliment the CII for having taken this initiative to organize this India-Africa cooperation seminar, and there are about totally 9 sessions which would form part of this event today and tomorrow. And after this inaugural event, there will be 9 sessions, one by one, and the sessions have been chosen very carefully and are in areas which provide great opportunity for cooperation between India and Africa. The first session is on trade and investment promotion. The theme of the second session is on sustainable development, and as you are aware, almost the entire global community is committed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. The third session will be on collaboration in power sector, including renewable energy. And in renewable energy, India has taken the initiative in forging ahead with the International Solar Alliance. And many African countries are today signatories to the framework agreement under the International Solar Agreement. The theme of the fourth session is agriculture. Africa is home to 60% of world's arable land, accounting for only about 10% of global agricultural output. The agriculture sector in Africa, therefore, is obviously operating much below potential and has immense possibility. In India, a lot of research has taken place, a lot of innovations have taken place. We have had the experience of the Green Revolution, and now India is witnessing a kind of a second Green Revolution, wherein the Green Revolution, the increase in production and productivity is being taken to the eastern part of the country, which traditionally have shown low productivity. So therefore, this is, when we discuss about agriculture, I think this is again an area where India can play a very key role in partnering with many African countries. The fifth session of the seminar organized by CII is focused on Exim Bank's, that is Indian Exim Bank's lines of credit. And this session will deliberate on ways to make the lines of credit more effective. And there are several success stories which the Exim Bank has in its experience in Africa, and they will be making presentations about the same. The sixth session is on skill development. Both India and Africa have a very young population, with 60% of the population being below the age of 35. Now, this demographic advantage has to be capitalized, otherwise it can become a demographic liability. And this is one area where in India, the government has launched a Skill India mission, and this is again a great opportunity for us to cooperate and to share experiences and work together. The seventh session is on healthcare, and India is the third largest pharmaceutical product supplier to Africa. Indian manufacturers are also leaders in supply of affordable vaccines, and this session will focus on collaboration on healthcare technologies and innovative healthcare cooperation projects. The eighth session is focused on e-governance. India has taken lots of initiatives over the last 3 years on e-governance. I am not going to delve further details on it. I am sure when the session takes place, many experts who are in the panel will be able to share experiences. The concluding session will be on manufacturing. In the context of the Make in India campaign and the Make in India program, which has been launched by the Government of India, and the associated success stories that we have as a result of the Make in India initiative, this is again a very timely chosen subject of discussing about developing cooperation and working together with regard to deepening manufacturing activities in Africa, which eventually leads to higher growth and higher employment generation. I'm sure over the next 3 days, these discussions, next 2 to 3 days, these discussions will open up new possibilities of cooperation between India and Africa. And in conclusion, I would like to once again congratulate and thank CII for having taken this initiative. I once again on behalf of the government and on behalf of all my colleagues, welcome all the distinguished delegates who have come from the African continent and from other continents and from other parts of the world to this excellent event that is being hosted here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Das, for those perspectives. May I now invite Mr. Charles Boama, the Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank, to give his special address.
Your Excellency, Honorable Arun Jaitley, Minister of Finance for India, Your Excellency, Mr. Daniel Kablan-Duncan, Vice President, Republic of Cote d'Ivoire. I may also take I recognize the President of the African Development Bank just walked in, Mr. President, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, and Mr. Rakesh Abati-Mittal, President-designate the CII. I also recognize, of course, David Raskina, and Mr. Banerjee, and also Mr. Das here at the podium. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great pleasure to be here. You said this is the fourth meeting of the African Development Bank outside the continent. It is indeed also the second in Asia. And we thank you for the warm welcome that we have enjoyed since the last few days we've been here. Let me, my remarks, you will note will also echo many of the points that have been made that also talk about essentially how we have so much in common. As you all know, ladies and gentlemen, the global economy, the global economic environment, shall we say, is still in a little bit of a morose state. The global economy is expected to grow by just 3% or so in 2007, and is characterized by depressed commodity prices, low growth in emerging markets, and rising interest rates in the US. However, Africa still accounts for 5 of the 10 fastest growing economies, and that was said earlier, in the world, and it's expected to achieve growth rates well in excess of 3.5% this year. Africa's population is about 1.2 billion people, and it's also host to the continent. Africa is host to the youngest population in the world. In fact, the youth population is expected to double to about 840 million by 2050. Foreign direct investment inflows into Africa have risen from about 10 billion or so in 2000 to some 65 billion in 2016, making Africa an investment destination choice. However, it is still also fair to say that Africa still faces some challenges. And I'll just mention a few. Today, as we sit here, over 600 million, indeed over 650 million Africans do not have access to electricity. Agriculture is still largely whole and rain-fed based, and the continent spends about $35 billion every year importing food. The continent accounts for only about 2% of the world's merchandise exports, while intra-African trade is only 15% or so. Of course, youth unemployment is still very high across the continent. Now, it is precisely these challenges that the African Development Bank has set out to work with African countries to tackle. And how are we doing that? We are doing that by our program, what we call the High Fives. Basically, 5 priority areas that we've identified. And I'll just take a few minutes to go over those high fives, but you will notice that what the CII just talked about in terms of the areas very much mirror the high 5 areas that the African Development Bank has also identified. It's also interesting to note that a recent study by the UNDP basically showed, an independent study by them, showed that the high fives that I'm about to just briefly describe to you, when implemented, notice I didn't say if implemented, when implemented, will accomplish 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals and about the same percentage of the African Union's Agenda 2063. So there is quite a bit at stake here in the high fives, and in implementing the high five, you are indeed attacking the Sustainable Development Goals. You're also very much making great progress on African Union's Agenda 2063. Well, what are these high fives? First, light up, empower Africa. I already alluded to the over 650 million Africans without access to electricity. Feed Africa is the second of the high fives. We have industrialized Africa. We have integrated Africa and improved the quality of lives of the people of Africa. Now, I'll take just a few minutes very briefly to go over each of these high five areas. Now, first, let's take the Light Up Empower Africa. What we're looking to do here by this first of the high fives is to provide universal access to electricity by 2025. It's not that far away. We're looking 8 years from now. Now that is the African Development Bank, intend to invest $12 billion over the next 5 years. And in so doing, we also are looking to leverage into the energy sector some $40 to $50 billion. So lots of investment opportunities really await those that will come with us, and we expect there will be many. For Feed Africa, we intend to make Africa a net food exporter. I talked about the 35 billion or so annual imports of food, and move Africa to the top of the export-oriented global value chains where it has competitive advantage. Now we plan, again, the African Development Bank plans to invest $24 billion over the next 10 years to help drive Africa's agricultural transformation. And here we're talking about the entire value chain from production, agribusiness, the whole value chain is where we expect to be. Now, industrializing Africa, we plan to raise the share of the value-added manufacturing in Africa, Africa's GDP, and increase Africa's share of global merchandise exports. Now here we plan to increase our investments to the tune of $2.5 to $4 billion per year. So this is what we're looking to do in the industrialized Africa side. Integrate Africa, which is the fourth of the high fives. Here we're looking to increase the links amongst African countries, create larger markets by so doing, and indeed also create greater opportunities for those that come to invest in Africa by having larger markets. And here we're doing this by investing in connectivity, investing in corridors, transport corridors, etc. And this is a major part of our program over the next few years. Now, the fifth of the high five is the improving the quality of lives of the people of Africa. Here, it is to create opportunities for the youth and women in Africa to start small enterprises, equip them with science, technology, and engineering and mathematical skills, an area that India has excelled very well. We plan to create 123 skills enhancement zones to endow youth entrepreneurs with the requisite skills. And we also intend to train 234,000 new coders and 130 coding centers by 2025. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, indeed, financing the high fives will require quite a significant amount of money. I already referred to some of the numbers. And to be able to do that, in fact, by some estimates, you're looking easily between 160 to $200 billion per year is what we're looking at in terms of the financing requirements. Now, this will require significant partnerships to be able to accomplish. And India is, of course, a strong supporter of the Africa and the African Development Bank. I'll take a few seconds to talk a bit about, for those that are not familiar with this relationship, India joined the African Development Bank in 1983 and has contributed to all the general capital increases. There have been 6 of them since then. At the India-Africa Forum in 2015, India pledged $10 billion line of credit to Africa to be delivered over the next 5 years through Exim Bank. I think there was a reference to that earlier. And in addition, India's bilateral trade with Africa has risen 5-fold in the last decade, from some $11–12 billion in 2005-2006 to almost $56.7 billion in 2015, so over that 10-year period. Now, this is expected to reach $100 billion by 2018. So this is an impressive trajectory. I'd like to thank the government and the people of India for believing in Africa. And I'm sure you found out that that belief has not been misplaced at all. There are several specific initiatives that I'd like to, between India and the African Development Bank, to enhance the high fives that are already underway. So as we talk about this, there are many things that are already taking place, such as the Lighthouse India approach that focuses on expanding renewable energy access to rural households. India has also established the International Solar Alliance, the ISA, and the bank is, we, the African Development Bank, we position ourselves to be the possible recipient of a $2 billion envelope that will be used for co-financing, either parallel co-financing or joint co-financing projects. There is also a project that we co-financed, which is called the Kukuza Project Development Company, which was set up by the bank, the African Development Bank, the State Bank of India, and the Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services Limited in 2015. Now, this company is mandated to support the development of infrastructure projects in Africa by developing a pipeline of bankable infrastructure projects. I'm sure this will resonate with many of you that always talk about the lack of bankable projects. So this is intended to essentially address that need. And then there's the Make in India initiative, through which India can share experience in manufacturing, automobile, computers, apparel, and construction. India has also a global reputation, of course, we all know, in the software and business processing industry. And there is indeed a lot which the bank and Africa can emulate from India. Just take a look at this state, our host, the state of Gujarat. It has universal access to electricity, no power outages. Rural areas have power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I believe 90% of the world's rough diamonds are cut and polished right here. Ladies and gentlemen, this indeed is industrialization. Now, Gujarat's economy is diversified, about 50% of the GDP now coming from the service sectors. Its agriculture is prosperous and modern. It creates jobs, and I understand very impressively the unemployment rate is less than 1%. It has some of the world's best medical centers, and because of its vast seashore line, it is vital for economic integration of India. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by reaffirming that Africa is the continent of opportunity. I think Exim Bank just talked about that. And why do we say that? It has over 65% of the uncultivated arable land in the world's youngest population, just to name a few. And the African Development Bank, the premier development institution for Africa, and indeed the trusted partner of African countries, has the financing instruments, the critical mass, and thus is ready to work with you all to enhance the implementation of the high fives that I've just described. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. And may I now request our guest of honor for his special address, Mr. Daniel Kablan Duncan, the Vice President of the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire.
one of the problems is that I've prepared my statement in French, but I've seen there's no direct translation. So, well, I'll venture to speak in English, but that will be at your own risk, of course. Well, the Honorable Arun Jaitley, Minister of Finance and Defense of the Federal Republic of India, Governors of African Development Bank Group, Mr. Adesina and Mr. Bohama, President, Vice President of African Development Bank, Excellencies Ambassador, the Chief Minister of State of Gujarat, the Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Finance and Defense, the President and the Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industries, Managing Director of Exim Bank, honorable guests, member of the media, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, His Excellency Mr. Alassane Ouattara, on the occasion of the inaugural session of the Forum on Africa-India Cooperation, it is with great honor that I addressed this august audience on the theme of this year, Partnerships for Industrialization and Stronger Integration of Africa in Value Chains. The debate should be articulated around the 5 priorities defined by African Development Bank for the transformation of the continent, were namely Enlighten Africa, Feeding Africa, Industrialize Africa, Integrate Africa, and improve the quality of living conditions of the people of Africa, as Mr. Bohama developed here. Before going into the heart of this important subject, I would like to express our sincere thanks to the Prime Minister and the government of India for the kind invitation to participate in this important meeting and for the very warm welcome which has been extended to myself and to my delegation since our arrival in this great and beautiful country. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the cultural and economic links between India and Africa go far beyond the chapati, this delicious bread that Kenyans love, and the tea, chai, mixture of tea, milk, sugar, and spice, drink favorite in Nairobi. These enduring links have crossed the time of trade from previous centuries and political struggle for the independence of Africa. Let us not forget that Mahatma Gandhi, then a younger lawyer, spent 21 years of his long march to freedom in South Africa. By 2015, the Indian population in Africa was estimated at 2.7 million people. It is thus an old and fusional relationship in which the Indian private sector has played and continues to play a decisive role between India and Africa. This relationship is marked by the tradition of a strong presence of Indian companies, particularly in Southern and Eastern Africa. Over the past decade, India has given new impetus to its long-standing partnership with Africa by positioning itself since the first India-Africa summit held in New Delhi in April 2008. As one of the emerging countries, a major player of the development of the African continent, alongside with China and Brazil. The revitalization of the African-Indian cooperation is harmoniously integrated within the framework of South-South cooperation, particularly in the light of the changing geopolitical interests of countries of the North, guided by the imperative of the diversification of economic and political partners from the side of African states. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa certainly has much to gain from its cooperation with India. To do so, it needs to have a clear vision of its own development, effective frameworks and institutions, as well as coherent and innovative internal and external policies, with bold structural and sectoral reforms, as will command the rapid evolution of the global environment. The implementation of the African Union 2063 agenda and the African Development Bank ADB Top 5 strategy meets these requirements. These two agendas will surely guide Africa cooperation with India in a direction increasingly in line with its own interests in a win-win partnership. With an average economic growth rate of about 5% over the past decade, well above the world average of 2.8%, Africa is now visible on economic maps. It should be noted, however, that Africa economic growth has not created sufficient employment, especially for its youth, which account for more than 60% of its population. The decline of poverty rate has remained fairly low, although some countries have made good progress. It is to be noted that so far, trade in raw material only have remained the main driver of the African economic dynamism. There remains, therefore, a very important challenge for strengthening value-added manufacturing and services, and thus for the structural transformation of African economies. Conversely, India, a country with which Africa has family ties, I will say, have succeeded in removing a significant segment of its population out of poverty, thanks to its economic performance based on the structural transformation of its economy driven by rapid industrialization. It is here that the already dynamic partnership between Africa and India needs to grow and diversify further, given the wide range of investment opportunities offered by the African continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, India, as you know, is a large industrial country already strongly present in Africa. The country has state-of-the-art industries. India is the world's largest producer of software, and its electronic industries in general, and computer in particular, are highly performant. India investment continues to increase in Africa. An illustration is the second mobile operator in Africa, Airtel, a subsidiary of Bharti Airtel, a multinational telecommunication company based in New Delhi, which is already present in 18 countries. Well, there are a long list of companies, Tata Holdings, as one knows, and ArcelorMittal, Coal India, and so on. The Indian private sector thus offers undeniable opportunities for the development of strong partnership with African enterprises, with a view to industrialization and diversification of African economies. To accelerate this momentum, Indian Prime Minister, as you know, Narendra Modi, announced at the closing of the India-Africa Summit in 2015 the establishment of a 20 billion line of credit to encourage companies to invest in Africa. Credit line must be strengthened in favor of African countries whose development needs call for increasing funding while promoting Africa-India joint ventures, notably with the creation of the India-Africa Business Council. In addition, India could benefit from African entrepreneurs from its stronger network of suppliers that could contribute to the establishment of specific industries in our countries. Well, that has been mentioned by Mr. Bouma. As you know, Africa has about 1.2 billion people, almost as much as the Indian subcontinent. Africa is expected to house 2.5 billion people by 2050, according to the forecast. By eliminating bottlenecks and accelerating its industrialization, Africa could strengthen its trade and move more prominently in global value chains. To this end, Africa could draw inspiration from and benefit from India's strategy of developing a successfully domestic private sector capable of not only harnessing domestic growth, but also competing internationally. In this current context of regional integration, as a resolute option for Africa, Africa economic and trade strategies toward India should be built around regional communities. To sustain the African industrialization in the long term, our partnership should also extend to the funding and building of structural infrastructures, in particular in the energies, port, roads, airports, railway sectors. We must also consider the development of the human capital required to support technological innovations of the continent. India's expertise also allows the training of an increasing number of young Africans. The scholarship awards programs and the implementation of the Pan-African Online Services Network project, which connect with some 50 African countries, are to be welcome and deepening. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, before finishing my statement, I would like to say that as far as my country, Côte d'Ivoire, is concerned, the structural and sectoral reforms implemented since 2011 has produced very encouraging results, including an average annual economic growth rate of 9% over the past 5 years, making our country's Côte d'Ivoire one of the most dynamic economies in the world. The average inflation rate is contained at less than 2%, and the government deficit, global deficit, is at 3.4% over the same period of 5 years. As we are aware, agriculture is the dominant sector of the Ivorian economy. It contributes to about 22% of GDP, account for 2/3 of employment and 67% of the export earnings. In addition, 90% of our agricultural products are exported in primary forms. The government has therefore pledged to make the development of agro-industry a priority. To this end, our country has adopted a bold industrial policy oriented towards a greater transformation of our basic products by the national and international private sector. Thus, and as an example, for the cocoa, for which we are the world's largest producer with nearly 2 million tons, we want to bring the first transformation, currently now at 33%, to at least 50% by 2020. For the cashew nut, you know that India was the largest producer 2 years ago, but now the world's largest producer is Côte d'Ivoire, unfortunately. Well, we produce above 700,000 tons currently, with a forecast of 1 million tons by 2020. We want to achieve 100% primary processing rate by 2020-2025. This by promoting joint ventures with private sectors, countries such as India, which is the first buyer of our raw cashew nuts. In addition to this action, there is a significant investment in economic infrastructure, notably transport and energy, in order to support this ongoing structural transformation. For example, with regard to transport sector, the government has upgraded about 30,000 kilometers of road and 250 kilometers of highways throughout the country. In this field of the energy, the objective is to make our country an energy hub by raising the installed capacity of electricity from 2,000 now to 4,000. So there are a lot of possibilities to invest because these investments is made by the private sector. The creation of a free zone of biotechnology and transformation and information and communication technologies, together with what we call the Mahatma Gandhi Technology Park in Grand Bassam, is the largest high-tech infrastructure in the West African sub-region, with 640 hectares. 180 are now ready for investment for the private sector, both national and international. In all these sectors, the Indian private sectors can play a more prominent role, as it is already demonstrated by its presence in the countries of the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, industrialization and international trade are the future of Africa, a continent, as mentioned earlier, of opportunities and prosperity. Building this future with a strong win-win partnership with these great countries of India is a proposal that we fully endorse. It is now a question of putting it into practice, and by so doing, opening up to the African youth this window of prosperity which it calls, which it vows. Thank you for your kind attention. Merci beaucoup. As I mentioned, it was at your own risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure and honor to invite and request our chief guest for this function, Honorable Sri Arun Jaitley, the Minister for Finance, Corporate Affairs and Defense of the Government of India, to give his keynote address.
His Excellency, Vice President Duncan, the Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Charles Bomaya, Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Mr. Shaktikant Das, President Designate of the CII, Mr. Rakesh Bharati Mittal, Mr. David Raskina from the Exim Bank, the Director General of the CII, Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with a warm welcome to our African guests today. We are really privileged to host you on the occasion of the 52nd annual meeting of the African Development Bank. I'm thankful to all the previous speakers for their thoughtful comments and suggestions, which have set the tone for a deep and a meaningful deliberation over the next few days. A lot has been said about the potential of Africa and the India-Africa partnership. Let me, without repeating, emphasize a few points. First, India-Africa cooperation is not a one-off event. This has been central to our strategic policy and over the last several years. The present government has provided a fresh impetus to these efforts. Our commitment is reflected in a continuous, high-level political engagement with African countries at a scale never witnessed before. Besides the 16 visits undertaken by the President, the Vice President, the Prime Minister, and the ministers, have also taken visits to each of the remaining African countries. Secondly, our partnership model is unique. Being an emerging economy itself, we understand that a prescriptive model of partnership does not work. Therefore, the cornerstone of our policy is voluntary partnership. It is demand-driven and devoid of any conditionality. We do not impose and leave it to our partners to decide what is best for them. We believe this is the most effective way of building partnerships. Thirdly, India-Africa cooperation should be wide-ranging. Having many similar challenges, we can learn from each other's experience. For instance, India and Africa have similar demographics with a young population. We need to create jobs to take advantage of the demographic dividend. The President's High Fives agenda is not very different from our own policy priorities. Fourthly, India's sustained engagement is already making an impact on Africa. I would like to mention a few facts of the African Development Bank's African Economic Outlook of 2016. Emerging economies are now a vital source of foreign direct investment in Africa. India's share of announced greenfield investment projects grew from 3.3% in 2003 to 2008 to 6.1% in 2009-2015. During the same time, China's share fell from 4.9% to 3.3%. India is amongst the most important emerging investors in Africa. In terms of greenfield projects, India was the fourth largest investment with 45 projects in 2015 after the United States, United Kingdom, and the United Arab Emirates. Declining exports to the United States and a weak demand in Europe have increased the importance of BRICS countries. In 2009, only 24% of Africa's exports went to emerging countries. In 2014, the BRICS, including India and other emerging economies, accounted for nearly 1/2 of Africa's total exports to the world. Therefore, we are on the right track. But the India-Africa partnership provides limitless possibilities. If India is the bright spot in the world's economy, Africa is also not far behind. In 2015, Africa was the second fastest growing region in the world after East Asia. If we can translate the aspirations of 1/3 of humanity into reality, it would no doubt do wonders. India and Africa together can shape the future of the world. I'm sure the deep discussions over the next 4 days will result into many concrete and implementable ideas. When we conclude the discussions in this forum, we should be closer to ushering in a new chapter in India-Africa relations. I end this with my sincere thanks to the CII for taking this lead in organizing this event. I am also thankful to the African Development Bank for accommodating us and providing us this platform. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Honorable Finance Minister, for your address and for really putting into perspective the relationship between Africa and India, the 16 visits that has already taken place that you mentioned, and the uniqueness of this partnership and the perspective that you gave that this being demand-driven. And you really did reiterate so very strongly India's commitment to this relationship and to the continent of Africa, and that it is indeed mutually beneficial relationship with many wide-ranging collaboration. Thank you for your remarks as the chief guest of this function and really setting the tone under which the discussions would follow in the sessions to come. Excellency, the Vice President of the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire, thank you for your participation. You have all consistently been present in many industry dialogue between the African continent and India, and today has been no exception. We really thank you for taking time out and always being present with us. I'd like to put on record our thanks to the Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank and also to the President who dropped in for a few while. And Mr. Vice President, you very clearly mentioned and elaborated the scope under the high five, the type of collaborations that we can have, and the sessions which Mr. Shaktikanta Das referred to in his speech as to how we are going to, how he has helped craft this program, takes into account some of these very important big five thoughts of yours, which will be discussed and deliberated over the sessions to come. And we really do appreciate the African Development Bank giving us this platform, giving us this huge opportunity, and really taking this program to such an important level. I'd like to also put on record our thanks to the African dignitaries and the African delegates who have traveled to participate in this session of Africa-India Cooperation 2017, the partnership to industrialize and move Africa up the value chain. I'd like to also record a strong thanks to the government of Gujarat for providing us this such warm hospitality. Mr. Anil Mukim, the Additional Chief Secretary of Finance, is present here, and other senior members of the Gujarat government would like to sincerely thank you for giving us this the warm hospitality which you are always known for. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for participating. Thank you very much for being here. We conclude the inaugural session with this program. Thank you.